Thank you so much for joining us, and a warm welcome to Asia Art Archive. My name is Özge Ersoy. I'm the public program lead at Asia Art Archive. And for those of you who are less familiar with what we do, we are a not-for-profit organization that focuses on recent art from across Asia. If you haven't been to the 11th floor, please check out our library that's open to the public 6 days a week from 10 to 6. And we also have a number of digital collections of archives by artists, art historians, and educators that you can browse on our website. So today we are very, very happy to have Peggy Levitt with us. Peggy is a sociologist, and I'll just make sure that I pronounce these correctly. So she's the chair of Department of Sociology and Loyola Lamar Slaner Professor in Latin American Studies at Wesley College. She's also co-director of Harvard University's Politics and Social Change Workshop. Peggy's current research, it looks at global citizenship and global social protection. And for today, she will specifically speak about her research on museums, how museum curators, educators, or directors think about their responsibilities towards different type of communities and how they contribute to the changing discussions around citizenship. I also want to say that this is the very first public talk in our new series that we are developing at Asia Art Archive, and it's called Who Owns It? This particular series will look at different types of ideas like the sense of ownership, custodianship, and community building. And maybe one thing that I can say is that as an organization that is the custodian of numerous publications and archives, we constantly think about audience participation, and not audience participation in the sense of counting the visitor numbers, but thinking about or imagining museums or archives or organizations where visitors are not necessarily these passive receivers of the content that we produce, but audiences, they inspire or they provoke the content that we create together. So, and audiences that would have a sense of ownership towards what an organization can do. So without further ado, maybe we can start with Peggy. And thank you so much for joining us again. We'll have a Q&A after the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and thank you to Claire and Özge and everyone here at the Asia Art Archive for organizing my trip, and very warm welcome. I'm going to start tonight with a short anecdote about Sir Hans Sloane. Maybe that name might ring a bell for some of you, but even as a small boy, he was always interested in science and physics and botany, and he went on to study medicine and physics, and had just been accepted into the Royal College of Physicians in London when he got a job offer that he couldn't refuse. So Christopher Monk, who was the second Duke of Albemarle, had just been appointed to be the new Governor General of the Territories of Jamaica, and he wanted a personal physician to go along with him. And so Sir Hans, who wasn't Sir Hans then, Hans Sloane, went not only out of a sense of duty, but because he knew he'd be able to collect all kinds of rocks and shells and plant life, and many of his friends were doing that as well. And so he didn't really want to be left out of the frenzy to bring things back from around the world. But his adventure ended very quickly because the Governor General passed away, and so his last task as his physician was to bring back his remains to England, along with the collection of materials that he had started to amass. And so he returned to England and had a very distinguished career as a physician, but also continued to collect things from all over the world. So plants and rocks and shells from as far afield as China and Japan and the Philippines, and also a treasure trove of personal papers and manuscripts written by the people who were studying these materials. And to accommodate these massive holdings, he bought the property that was next to him, his house in Bloomsbury Square. And he realized that these materials had intrinsic value to the public, and so he was very open to having people come and look at them, just like the Asia Archive is today. And that's how his collection became one of the founding collections of the British Museum. So as a result, the former director, Neil McGregor, who was being interviewed by the then president and director of the Art Institute of Chicago, James Cuny, in 2009, said that the British Museum was never a national collection. It was always, he explained, a collection of the whole world, meant to be studied by people across the globe so they could understand the world better, not the nation. Sir Hans wanted visitors to recognize that people around the world had a lot in common. In a way, said Mr. McGregor, what the British Museum is about is an attempt to create a new kind of citizen, a citizen that would be a citizen of the whole world and able to compare what happens in one part of the world to what happens in another, and above all, to see how interconnected the world is. But if the British Parliament hadn't been interested in his collection, he would have given it gladly to St. Petersburg, Berlin, Paris, or Madrid in that order. Of course, Mr. McGregor admits, putting the world on display and how the objects got to London, the museum uses to do so, is part and parcel of British imperialism. But the museum, he says, has always been about something different, about understanding and comparing and making knowledge, and through knowledge, generating tolerance to make knowledge deeper and to share it. But you know that ever since the leaders of the French, new French Republic in the late 1700s opened the doors of the Louvre to the public to showcase what had been the royal collections for the first time, museums have also played a really important role in nation building and creating national citizens. They help to shape a unified team out of people who would never know each other. This is Benedict Anderson's idea about imagined communities. And even now, museums around the world, and I'd be curious to hear what you think about museums in Hong Kong, but you go into the national wing, whether it's the American wing or the British wing or the Spanish wing, and you're being told something about what the nation is and what it values. So my question in writing this book, on which my talk is based today, is in this global world, what kind of citizens are museums creating? And I think that this got, yeah, I'm just going to start with that one. What kinds of citizens are museums creating? How does the globalization of the museum world affect local institutions? And how do local institutions speak back? And what is it about particular cities and nations which help explain the answer? So how does the task of creating national citizens and global citizens intersect? And how is it negotiated, and with what possibilities? So to answer these questions, I visited museums in Europe and the United States and Asia and the Middle East. So I talked to curators and museum directors and policymakers about their past and future and current exhibits, and about their collections, the iconic objects that define what's in their storerooms and in their showcases, and some of the benefactors, the kind of quirky benefactors that have contributed to these collections. So I'm really looking at three sets of two countries. So I'm looking at Sweden and Denmark that are sort of over empire and more or less comfortable with the role of playing a more modest role on the world stage. I'm looking at museums in Boston and New York in the United States, and that's my set of cases that are either in a country that still sees itself at the top of its empire, or some would say is on its way down. And then I'm looking at museums in Doha and in Singapore, and those are my cases where the museums and cultural institutions in general are being used to sort of build the nation, but also enable the nation to stake a more prominent regional, if not global, role. So, okay. All right, so why are these questions important? Well, I think yesterday I was saying to the folks on the staff here that I had the opportunity, it seems like a weird word to use, but I was very interested to see all the domestic workers in the public spaces in Hong Kong yesterday. And so there are different neighborhoods in cities, whether we're talking about Kreuzberg in Berlin or Washington Heights in New York, or the Bijlmer, Kreuzberg in Berlin or the Bijlmer in Amsterdam, where you sort of can see the connections that people maintain to their homeland. So you're liable to see lots of whether it's money sending agencies or travel agencies or small grocery stores that are selling things that people miss from home. And these are ways that tell us that people are staying connected to their homelands at the same time that they are putting down roots in the places that they move. And so I think about this as people continuing to vote and pray and invest in businesses in the places that they come from at the same time that they buy homes and open stores and join the PTA in the countries where they settle. And this is not just highly educated professional migrants who are doing this, although they can do it with a lot greater ease and they have the papers and legal status to do it. But there's also labor migrants who are doing this, and they send, as you know, major amounts of money in the form of remittances, and many countries now depend upon those that money and are very much taking actions to make sure that those contributions continue. So in places like Mexico or Morocco, this is a major source of foreign currency, and so things like dual citizenship or the expatriate vote or some kind of customs break when you bring things back to the country, or encouragement to invest are things that sending country governments are doing to make sure that people stay connected. And also there's the idea of social remittances, or the ideas and practices and skills and know-how that people also exchange between sending and receiving countries. At the same time, we live in a world of heightened diversity. So some sociologists like Steve Verdevec have talked about places like London or New York as being super diverse or hyper diverse. And that's because you had many people coming from different countries before, and now you have more people coming from a more diverse range of countries that are also with a more diverse range of statuses. So sort of diversity, new diversity layered onto old diversity, and then you have, in a place like London, there are people from more than 179 countries and about 300 languages being used to teach students in the public school. Now, for some people, as I said, living life across borders comes easily. Like many of the museum professionals in my story, they have the education and skills and social contacts to take advantage of opportunities anywhere. But more and more, also like the construction workers who are building the buildings in Doha that I'm going to talk about, people are forced to live transnational lives because they can't gain an adequate foothold in the places that they come from or the places that they live. But either way, I think these dynamics are really changing the way we need to think about identity, we need to think about citizenship, and we need to think about how social life gets lived. So how families raise their children and take care of their elderly, where you fulfill the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, where you pray, what kinds of religious leaders that you're following. And so this is part of what I'm trying to do with my work. But I think we're not going to understand grasp these dynamics and sort of integrate them into how we truly understand the world, or create different kinds of social institutions that reflect these new realities, unless we have a different vocabulary with which to talk about the nation and with which to talk about identity that doesn't necessarily stop at national borders. We need new ways of understanding these dynamics that take into account that lots of people belong to many groups at one time, and that multiple allegiance can coexist with each other, not necessarily compete with each other, and sometimes they can even complement each other. So that's where museums come in, because I think, as Mr. McGregor talked about, they're one of the many messy arenas where we might diversify, where nations might diversify their self-portraits and create more cosmopolitan nations. So let me just say a little bit about the methods that I use to do this, to write this book. So as I said, I went around the world to 7 cities and interviewed curators and educators and museum directors and academics, critics, and I didn't look just at national museums. I looked at all different kinds of museums, because I think that these show us they all offer us a different window onto the nation. So ethnographic museums are also about what people brought back and what they thought was important to show citizens, and also how citizens in the faraway country that the materials came from were positioned in relation to the country that was collecting those materials, or stealing those materials, or robbing those materials. I also did a lot of participant observation, so listening to public programming, observing docent talks, trying to see what all kinds of activities that are done at the museum, both formally and informally. And then I looked at information about past and present exhibits and all kinds of programs. But I have to say that this is not an evaluation. It's not a study about how well people take away the messages that curators are trying to communicate. It's just what curators and museum professionals think that they're doing. So before I go on and tell you my findings, I want to say a little bit more about what I mean by cosmopolitanism. So I treated this as an empirical question. In other words, I wasn't assuming that curators think that they're creating citizens, and if they were, that they would be national or global. And so it was an empirical question: is this part of your work? And if it is, what does that mean to you? And it turned out that people thought about cosmopolitanism or global citizenship in 3 ways. So the first piece is that there are cosmopolitan ideas and values. The second piece is that there are cosmopolitan practices and skills, or in other words, what you need to do to be able to participate and engage with people who are different than you. And then the third piece is cosmopolitics, or what kind of political project would you need to be able to create a more cosmopolitan world. And these things didn't necessarily go together. So what are cosmopolitan skills and ideas and skills? Well, things like tolerance and critical thinking and listening and curiosity, empathy, reflexivity, and an interest in and willingness to engage with different people and different kinds of experiences. Sometimes things like human rights or gender equality or democracy came up, but these were clearly more difficult sells in places like Singapore and Doha. And then cosmopolitan projects came up much less frequently and are much more difficult to agree upon. So at the end of the day, I kind of synthesized all of this and think of it as both the willingness and ability to participate in a conversation about what the common ground might be in a particular time, in a particular place. So it's recognizing the need for such a dialogue between diverse conversation partners who have the discipline and skills to move it forward, but not some kind of recipe book about what those values are and who gets to embrace them. So let me just say a little bit more about the role of museums and how they've always been part of nation building. Because, as I said, people come into museums and are supposed to recognize the objects and traditions and values on display and feel some sort of connection to them and feel part of the group that embraces them. But they've never been egalitarian projects. They have exposed visitors to a certain kind of knowledge based on a certain set of values, and the ordering and reordering of the objects and their position in relation to each other legitimize particular social and political hierarchies. So privileging certain ways of knowing and excluding others. So we're trained to kind of think about culture as something factual and simple and real, and we often come into museums ready to engage in that kind of viewing and assimilating some kind of objective truth that are communicated through the rhetorics of values that are expressed in the exhibition designs and the text and the lighting. And so, for example, when you walk into a museum, I think about some of the world's great museums, and you're often ascending up a grand staircase, and then you walk into a big entrance hall that's kind of like a temple of knowledge. So this kind of Western superior triumphalism is being expressed by the bricks and mortar of the building itself, and then within the galleries, the way that the objects are placed in relation to each other is also communicating something about what's valuable. So if the object that's in the center of the gallery and has lots of lights on it and lots of information about it is clearly more valuable than the object that's in the way back, that's in the dark, or that's under your sight line. And so we don't necessarily know how to read the space that way, but these value judgments are being communicated to us. So here's how Kim Benzel, who's an associate curator at the Metropolitan Museum, described this to me. She was talking about how curators often refer to real estate and how it's distributed within the museum building. So she said, if you come into the Met just cold, there's now a fabulously grand spread of Greek and Roman to your left, and an enormous spread of vast and grand Egyptian to your right, and then up the stairs is European paintings. Since time immemorial, that's been the holy of holies of many Western institutions. You really have to look if you want to find Africa or Latin America. So as a result, some people see museums as kind of beyond salvation. They're just too flawed to right their historical wrongs. Hassan Hag, the anthropologist, is a proponent of this view, and it would be impossible for them to get over their Western-centric genealogies. A second view just dismisses these critiques. So James Cuny, who I began with, who's now the president and CEO of the Getty Trust, in a book about this, ask readers if they really experience museums in this manner. Do you walk through the galleries of your local museum and feel controlled in any significant way? Do you feel manipulated by a higher power? He believes that museums still matter and that Enlightenment principles still apply. For people like Cuny, museums do not create citizens, be they national or global. They collect, classify, and present facts, calling into question unverified truths and opposing prejudice and superstition for the betterment of humankind. But a third view, held by many of the museum professionals that I spoke with, is that museums can and must reinvent themselves into socially relevant institutions for the 21st century. They know they're still primarily the stomping grounds of people with money in their wallets and degrees on their walls, but they also recognize the tremendous power that museums have in shaping public views, even among those who never cross their thresholds. And so they believe that museums can and must encourage things like empathy and curiosity and tolerance and creativity, in essence, cosmopolitan values, and that could help us engage more with the new immigrant who is next door, or understand that that person's family members live across the globe. And whether museums are consciously or willingly accepting this role, they necessarily star in that definition and redefinition of the national performance. So what explains where museums fall on what I came to think of as a cosmopolitan nationalism continuum? The differences I discovered in how museums do nationalism and globalism have a lot to do with their histories. So they're limited by their collections, by what they can borrow, and by their curators' fields of expertise. They also have a lot to do with whether they're privately or publicly funded. So Privately funded museums are beholden to their donors and their benefactors, and those are most of the museums in the United States. And publicly funded museums are beholden to governments. So, if, for example, I had people in Sweden talk about how museums were tools of social engineering. They're like hospitals or schools. We just use different tools to achieve our goals. Where museums fall on this continuum has to do with their scope. So whether they started life as an art museum or as a museum that was collecting and displaying things that people brought back, and they also have to do with the role that particular institutions play in the organizational ecology. So. It turns out that, there is a kind of conversation, formal or informal, between the cultural institutions in particular cities, and there is a kind of formal and informal delegation of responsibility. So often what are called city museums or constituency museums, so museums that are dealing with the experience of particular people, are the ones assigned to do diversity. And then the National Museum is then off the hook. But these differences in where you are on this cosmopolitan nationalism continuum also have to do with what I came to think of as the city's cultural armature. So these are deep cultural structures that are laid down by cities' founding fathers, and they usually are founding fathers. So what they thought about the responsibility of the individual to the collective, how much inequality are we going to tolerate in what's a good society? What's the collective's responsibility towards the poor? And so these kind of deeply rooted, deeply seated values continue to echo and ripple over time and find their way into the current day practice of cultural institutions. And a big part of this is what I call a diversity management regime. So that is if and how difference gets talked about, what kinds of words get used to talk about that difference, whether it's seen as an opportunity, having different people living among you is an opportunity or a problem, and then how you measure the differences among different people and what you want to do about those differences. So and these really vary. So for example, in the United States, we often talk about ourselves as being Indian American or Chinese American or Jewish American. And that is a way that new groups take their place at the multicultural table. So that is a way of nobody before Donald Trump's administration would have, or few people would have questioned that if you celebrate your Irishness or you celebrate your Italianness, it calls into question your Americanness. In fact, that's often what some people would say is being what being American is all about. So these are seen as labels of empowerment. The exact opposite is true in Scandinavia. So you're going to be very hard-pressed to find people who would claim to be a Pakistani Dane or an Iraqi Swede, because those same labels that are seen as empowering in the US context are seen as leading to social exclusion and social marginalization in the Scandinavian context. And this kind of way of managing diversity reflects itself in the museum landscape, because in the United States you have a lot more institutions dedicated to the experience of particular groups. So for those of you who have been to Washington, you might know that there's the Museum of the Native American. There's a museum that recently opened of the African American experience. There's a Holocaust museum. There's a museum dedicated to the experience of women. And there's no such parallel museological development in Scandinavia. So that is my first point about the urban cultural armature and the way diversity is managed as influencing where museums fall on this cosmopolitan nationalism continuum. The second point is where countries are in the global cultural hierarchy, and then how much they contribute to what I think of as a global museum assemblage, and how much they're influenced by it. So we can think about countries as being more prominent economically, more prominent politically. We can also think about countries as being more prominent culturally, right? And so where you are in that hierarchy, it influences how much you are a contributor to and are affected by this package or global museum assemblage, or ways of doing museum that I found around the world. So ways of displaying, ways of educating, ways of doing public programming that is kind of out there and known about, and then influences different museums depending upon how close they are or how far away they are from its orbit. So where do we see this, this museum assemblage? I see it in the new curatorial studies and museum education masters that are proliferating around the world. I see it in the blockbuster exhibits that we've all come to expect when we go to a museum. So, for example, gift shops and gourmet restaurants and sort of mega exhibits. I see it in the iconic museum buildings that many cities and states feel that they need to build, and many of them are built by a select group of architects. And I wouldn't say that the biennials and art fairs that are proliferating in the global north and south are part of this assemblage, but I think that they're in conversation with it. And I think that the institutions of global governance like ICOM, the International Committee on Museums, are part of this assemblage. But there's another piece, is this transnational class of museum directors and administrators and curators and educators who circulate regionally, if not globally, that are part of the assemblage but also carry pieces of it with them when they go from place to place. So these professionals, regardless of how long they stay, they are operating against a regional storyline that shapes their work as their work reshapes it. And then each time that they move, they kind of take this new way of doing work and vernacularize it to the new context. Okay. And then the last piece that I want to say about where museums fall on this cosmopolitan nationalism continuum is where a country is in the arc of its nation-building project. So are you using museums to kind of position yourself, fortify the nation, or rebuild the nation? So let me just, in the time that I have left, try to take you on a quick tour of some of the places that I visited. And the first place we're going to go to is Sweden. So Sweden, as many of you know, was a very homogeneous country until the 1940s, 1950s, and then by the 1990s had more and more immigrants, but still had this image of itself as, you know, a sort of white Christian country. And so the Minister of Culture, just in the same way that Sweden had used museums to make agricultural farmers, make them into middle class or industrial workers, they turned to museums to try to make immigrants into Swedes and to help Swedes understand that the country's changing face, the country was changing its face. And so one thing that the Minister of Culture did in the early 1990s was to create a museum authority that included 2 ethnographic museums, one in Gothenburg and one in Stockholm, and then a museum of Far Eastern antiquities and a museum of Near Eastern antiquities and the Museum of Mediterranean and Near Eastern antiquities. And so basically everything not Swedish put under this umbrella. And so the Museum of World Cultures is a museum that kind of reflects the idea that is true in Sweden, that being a global citizen is a good goal in and of itself, and that maybe we need to learn about global problems, and maybe we'll try to solve them in a particularly Swedish way, but that is a good thing, and then that ends up strengthening the nation. So these are photos from different exhibits at the Museum of World Cultures. This was an exhibit about Bollywood film posters that in another museum had been paired with objects that were teaching people about India and about Hinduism. And here the theme was about how cultural globalization doesn't mean Americanism, Americanization or Westernization, that there are many cores and many peripheries, and we need to sort of expand our understanding of what cultural globalization is. And then this next exhibit was called Destination X, and this was to get people to to think about what difference does it make for what difference the color of your skin or the color of your passport makes for your ability to move. And so this was an exhibit that asked people to contribute objects that they had taken with them on a journey. So maybe the dress that a woman took to Colombia when she was adopting her child, or the shoes that a pilgrim used on the pilgrimage. So many exhibits that are about more inclusive stories and about global issues. So this is from the museum, the National History Museum. And what they're trying to do in a special exhibit is to kind of fold in stories that have not been told in the traditional mainstream history. So this is the hidden histories of the LGBTQ community at the Swedish History Museum. So what I want to say here is that I think that this is both this approach and this emphasis on global citizenship as a good thing in and of itself reflects both Sweden's thinking about itself as a global exemplar. So long ago, and that solidarity doesn't stop at national borders. So long ago, Olof Palme, the prime minister, he was going his third way. He wasn't on the west, he wasn't on the east side in the Cold War. He thought that Sweden was an exemplar, its social welfare system was an exemplar. And so Sweden really saw itself as having this prominent role, and still does see itself as kind of out there and often at the head of humanitarian assistance efforts. And so this is reflected in museum practice that tries to communicate these things and teach museum visitors about this. But I would also say that this is about Sweden's rejection of nationalism. So Sweden doesn't want to deal with black blemishes on its record, such as what it did during World War II, or eugenics experiments, or how it's treated the Sami. So it's both an embrace of the global that we're seeing and a rejection of the national. So now we're going to go to Boston, where the Museum of Fine Arts created a new wing in 2010 that is the Art of the Americas wing. And the thing about this wing is that you're supposed to be able to get the punchline. It's 4 stories high, and it expanded the real estate of the museum by about 1/3. And so you're supposed to understand that the punchline is what the punchline is, whether you walk in on the ground floor or the first floor, the second floor, the third floor. And that is that American art was not just made in the United States, that it always was internationally influenced. So these are Quiche burial urns from Guatemala from 1750 AD. And they're at the bottom of they're in the basement floor. The museum prefers to call it the foundation floor. And the idea is that these indigenous art, whether it was made in Central America or North America or South America, is at the roots, at the foundation of American art. And so this is every time you walk off of the staircase, you see an iconic object that sort of crystallizes the story for the particular era that's represented. So this is the Liberty Bowl. This is an iconic national object, although when I give this talk in the United States, nobody can tell me what this is, so that says something about history. But this was made by Paul Revere, and it was made to commemorate the beginning of the American Revolution. But what's interesting about this is that it's very influenced by Chinese silversmithing at the time, because Boston was so oriented towards the east and the Far East trade that anybody who had any money wanted to have goods that would be from this part of the world. And so here is a picture of a portrait of Paul Revere, and this teapot that he's holding is also Chinese influenced. And then what the museum did also was to admit, and this is a big thing for this museum, which is known for its colonial New England collection, its colonial American collection, to admit that there was a colonial experience that took place in Spanish. So in part of the territories that were the United States, there was a colonial, that Spain was a colonizer. And so what they've done is to have a Spanish colonial gallery, and this is put alongside more of the English, the New England colonial materials. And what you're supposed to see are adjacencies. You're supposed to get the connection by seeing the material in one room and then seeing the material in the room next door and making the connection. So this is a portrait of Timothy Matlock, who is a lawyer in Philadelphia, and he's, you know, very royal and wearing very elegant clothing. And then this is, in the next room, a portrait of the Archbishop of Mexico, and he is also very royal and powerful, and, you know, sort of sitting in a very throne-like way. And so the idea here is that colonial authority, whether it was expressed through communion wafers and crucifixes or through legislation or law books, had a lot in common. So this is the story. So what I would say about the American wing is that, you know, this story about the stressing of international influences and how it shaped American art, and it's never just made in the USA, is very strong. But it doesn't, the next step is not taken to tell visitors what that means for how the nation should rethink its position looking out. So we learn a lot about looking in, we don't learn a lot about looking out. And I would say that that's a reflection of, you know, U.S. hubris and thinking that, you know, you're a superpower, the globalization means Americanization, and the rest of the world needs to come to us to understand it. And this is that kind of narcissism, I would say, is reflected also in museum practice. So last place on the tour. So this is Qatar. I'm going to use Qatar and Doha interchangeably because so much of the population is living in Doha. But this is a picture of Doha Bay in the 1980s. That's the first Sheraton hotel that was being built. And this is a picture of Doha today. So the skyline, this country has made this amazing transformation from a purling, you know, not very sedentary civilization to this. And so what I would say is that museums when I was doing my field work, and maybe someone here has visited this area, but it's a place that changes very quickly. And so when I was doing my field work, anywhere from 12 to 16 museums were on the docket. Now there have been budget cuts. Almost everyone that I talked with is gone, and I'm not sure how many museums are actually planned. But this is a place where museums are part of a purposeful strategy that uses many institutions to say something to the inside, to national citizens, and then to the outside world. So whether we're talking about museums, whether we're talking about hosting the World Cup, whether we're talking about Education City, which is a campus of US and European universities that have branches in Doha, whether we're talking about Al Jazeera in English, whether we're talking about Qatar Airways, those are all efforts, part of a cohesive strategy to say this is a country that is, you know, able to take its place on the world stage, can hold its own, that will take what it wants from the West and then disregard what it doesn't want because, you know, it's confident enough and unique enough and important enough to be able to do that. And so who is doing all of this? Well, in Qatar, just 12% of the people that live there are actually citizens, and then the rest are the transnational professionals that are designing these buildings or mounting these museums or teaching at the university, but many more of them are the construction workers and the nannies and the taxi drivers that are living under and working under deplorable conditions with very, very few rights and protections. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does citizenship means everything and nothing in this context, and very few people enjoy the protections of it, or the rights associated with it. So there were, when in 2012, when I was in Doha, there were 3 museums that were actually opened or near opening. So this is the Museum of Islamic Art. It's built by I.M. Pei, so one of the architects that I was talking about. It's a really impressive building that juts out into the bay. And this is the contemporary example of that fancy entrance hall that I was talking about. You walk into the lobby and you're sort of filled with awe, right? And then these are the galleries are very much, jewel-like presentations of this collection. Very little text, a lot of breathing room, a sort of, look at how the light kind of makes these look like we're looking at a Tiffany's window or something. And so a very strong message that, this is a country that has similarities with its neighbors, but is different enough from its neighbors, and can have a world-class Islamic art collection with a world-class building, and take its own place. But also, you need to be able to play in the contemporary art world. And so this is Mataf, the Contemporary Art Museum, and that is located kind of far away from the center of town. It's hard to find. There's construction sites there. And the role that this museum plays, the role that the Museum of Islamic Art plays, is that we're a country that can have a world-class Islamic art museum. And this says we can play in the contemporary art world. So you're not going to see exhibits about human trafficking or migration, but you are going to see exhibits like this one, which was an exhibit about Egyptology and a kind of critique. So this is actually a Tupperware sarcophagus, so kind of poking fun at this. And then this is the last museum, which is the National Museum, which every time I check has not yet opened. This is built by Jean Nouvel, another architect, and this is perhaps the most complicated project, because that's a museum that's being kind of narrated and curated. The history is being written with the help of this transnational class, and so people that have been in the country a very short time and are not that experienced with it, and so all the challenges that come along with that. So just to conclude, I think a world on the move produces opportunities and anxieties, more wealth and much more inequality, a decentering of power into more centers where power gets concentrated anew. It's no surprise that countries across the world are grappling with how to create citizens who can live successfully in diverse neighborhoods and who actively engage with the world at the same time. The many professionals and policymakers who I talk to shed light on how museums drive forward these dynamics and respond to them. In fact, my book includes 2 stories that, although intentioned, have to be told at the same time. It's about the role of museums in creating citizens, the project of crafting cosmopolitan values, competencies, and projects among people who also feel part of nations, regions, cities, and towns. At the same time, it tells the story of how global cultural production and consumption, as seen through the prism of the art world, influence and are influenced by these processes on the ground. So on the one hand, I tell how larger processes leave their footprint in simple everyday objects, such as those in museum showcases, of the way that culture is embedded in the materialities of everyday life. On the other, I tell about how these local expressions, which get uploaded, produce global culture, about how what happens inside and outside actual museums shapes global museum assemblages, and these mobile bundles of technologies, objects, expertise, organizational models, and sensibilities continuously circulate and get vernacularized and talk back, changing the constellation of elements they incorporate and shed as they continue on their way. A cadre of administrators, curators, and educators who often have prior work experience in several other countries are part of this constellation. Each time they move, they bring the ideas and skills and know-how they've just acquired to their new posts. I wrote this book at a particular moment. Notions of identity, including national identity and its relationship to cosmopolitanism, are not universal but historically and culturally specific. So what's entailed in thinking and doing the nation or the public, and what role museums play in that thinking and doing, is always changing. But what was constant across this snapshot was how interdependent the nation and the world are, that there is this continuum of cosmopolitan nationalism, and that the cosmopolitan side always comes with a dose of the national, and the national with some element of the cosmopolitan. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that museums are going to solve the problems of social inclusion or creating viable, diverse societies, but I think that they are an underutilized tool, although I would say that they're not a very agile tool. They're not quick at changing. And what I think is happening is that even if they don't want to take up this task, they're being forced to by the changing demography of the world. So people around the world seem to be realizing that the people who are inside museums don't look enough like the people who are outside of them, whether it's the visitors, the curators, the directors. And so I think that what we're seeing, even there are some museums that are taking up this cause and trying to make themselves more welcoming and more relevant on their own. But then there are others that are being pushed into it because if they want to survive and thrive and remain open in the 21st century, they need to do something different. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
This is working right now. May I ask you the first question if there is no... okay, all right. So maybe we just pass it along and... You can. Okay, I'll try. I think my question is about the moments of crisis that lead to change for these institutions or these museums, because I believe that users themselves, they do have the responsibility to articulate their demands and challenge museums for these changes to happen. For instance, a community can challenge a museum for hiring a curator or an art historian that they think doesn't represent their community, or they can say that they have to remove an artwork from an exhibition because it's culturally sensitive, or they can say you are doing censorship to a work that has to be there. And I'm wondering if you encountered any of these moments of crisis when you had your interviews with the museum curators, directors, and also with the users of these institutions.
Not when I was doing my field work, but I can certainly think of examples. But I think that you need to feel ownership over the museum. You need to feel like it's your place first to care enough about it to challenge things. And so I think that I saw different examples of museums doing that more proactively and more successfully than others. Your question makes me think about Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York City, who just got appointed to Donald Trump's legal team, so he seems to always come up in bad places. But he I forget the name of the artist, but it was an artist who had who did a painting that had, it was a
Jesus Christ thing.
it was a religious painting, and it had excrement on it, and Giuliani is an observant Catholic or Christian, and he took issue with that, pressured the museum to take the painting down, and there was a lot of pushback about that, and eventually the museum prevailed, because in New York City there's a public-private partnership between museums, and so museums get their buildings and their lighting and heat and stuff paid for by the city in exchange for this kind of responsibility to serve the public, and so that's why the mayor was able to kind of do that. But I think you're absolutely right. But I think that the prerequisite for it is to feel like this is my institution that I care about changing enough. So.
Thank you very much for covering the point with Doha. I think the museum's about to open in December 2018, this year.
Okay.
Well, I hope so anyway.
Really will?
Well, I'm working on it, so I hope so. A quick question. In your book, did you also look at the role of what I call silent curators? That is, people contracted through companies to actually lead on curating galleries, and how they fit into the stratum of people that you were considering who kind of work as transnationals or whatever point of place within the museum structure.
Are you one of those people?
I am. I've been
Okay.
working with the Qatari National Museums for 10 years,
Okay.
including on the Slavery Museum,
Okay.
and always as a contractor of a contracted firm.
Okay.
So I go there and I see my words and annotations, but my name doesn't appear anyway. So I just wondered how, have you encountered the workforce that's behind the scenes?
Right. I think that everyone that I interviewed was actually a Qatari Museum Authority, or whatever it's called now, Qatar Museums, employee. But I'm except for the folks who were working on the Musharraf project, and I'm not sure if they worked for the Qatar Museum Authority or they worked for that development. That's a project to develop like a downtown in Doha and kind of build a mixed-use, livable place, because all cities need to have downtowns. So that's another piece of the strategy that I was talking about. And those people seem to work for the development company who were involved with the Slavery Museum. But maybe you know better than I do.
Do you want me to
Yes, yeah, tell us.
Okay, so the Mashari Properties is a private company. It's really a development company, a property development company that was given the fort and 3 buildings that were regarded as heritage buildings, because they're the only 3 buildings in Qatar that date from the 1700s, and one of them being the home of a former pearl trader who owned slaves that we know from records, and that is now the only museum to people trafficking and slavery in the Arab Islamic world. But it's also a center for visiting students from schools and colleges now. So it is exactly what you're talking about. It is fashioning people's mind to try and move them into looking at the issue of human rights at home, as you say, in a state where there are some terrible atrocities against human rights.
Right.
So in that particular case, Mashari Properties contracted various companies around the world to basically design and curate different either parts of those 3 buildings or actually different galleries. And now the National Museum, which you also featured on your slides, the Desert Rose, is doing exactly the same thing. So each gallery is contracted to a different contractor around the world. I work with one based in London. And so it's this mosaic of contracted firms who then subcontract people like me with specialist skills to work on particular parts of the galleries.
Very interesting. I don't know how common that is in other parts of the world, but I will certainly look into it. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for a great talk. I was wondering if you followed up with what's happening in Sweden at this moment in time with their museums, because all those museums you were mentioning that were opened in the 1940s, all being closed, or there's a long-term plan to close all of them. So the Museum for Antiquities, the Mediterranean one, the Humankind, they're all going to merge into a world museum. And I was wondering that.
That's what they are.
Yeah, they're world. But it also means that they've now become, it's one place, but they've also removed most of their holdings into storage. So you only see about 10% of what they actually have. So it's another way of marginalizing in some ways what had been marginal before. So I was wondering how would that fit into your story of global citizen?
That they end up having budget problems and close things. I think it's the story of any museum. I mean, the museum. The story here is that it's up and down. So I mean, I was working at a particular time. I took a snapshot. As I said, in Doha, hardly any of the people that I talked with are still there. So it's a particular snapshot, but I'm not surprised that these things happen. I don't know what's going on in Sweden. I mean, I know that Sweden wants to open an immigration museum in Malmö, so not all the museums are closing, and I don't know the politics behind the particular these decisions that you're referring to right now. But you know, I'm not surprised that these things happen.
Right.
Yeah.
I had a question about whether you have any thoughts on the way that museum presentations can actually further the othering of people by depicting them in ways that make them, in a sense, more foreign. I was thinking about the Bollywood posters. And if you were to show posters of movies from America, it would give you a pretty maybe twisted or maybe accurate sense of American culture. But I've seen that, in my experience, it feels like a lot of times the presentations of other cultures actually make them seem more distant rather than more accessible. And I just wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Oh, I think that's definitely true. And I think, you know, curators are very well aware of that, or at least many of them that I talk to, and are trying not to repeat the mistakes of the past. I mean, critical museum studies or critical heritage studies is really all about not, you know, really thinking thoughtfully and critically and reflexively about not repeating that kind of museum practice.
Hi, I have a question about the response to all these changes in all these new museums that you show. For example, in Boston, you say they're changing all this from the foundation of art thing, and also in Doha, they have this new collection that doesn't exist before. And in relation to we are in Hong Kong, and there are so many new museums coming up that we've been waiting for so long as well. And all these collections are very new. And actually, locally in Hong Kong, a lot of people are rejecting the idea of having foreign collections, like the Imperial China Palace coming into one of these museums here. So I was wondering what the public or people visiting respond to these changes now.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, your question is about how museums are sort of bellwethers, or I'm not sure if that's the right word, thermometers of public sensibility and sentiment. So, you know, in Boston, there are a lot of people who thought, why didn't this happen? You know, oh, you're just getting around to telling this story now? This should have happened years ago. And there are a lot of people who thought it didn't go far enough. So the idea that those Native American materials are in the basement was critiqued, not as much as I expected in public conversations. The curator who was in charge of conceptualizing this whole renovation has a whole sort of architectural reason why some things have to be on the top floor and some things have to be on the bottom floor. But I think if you're really sensitive to the symbolism of those real estate choices, you might have thought of a way to organize things better. So I think, you know, it's all. I think the response also has to do with the owner. Going back to the ownership question about how much a community feels invested in their museum to even complain about it. So I'm kind of curious what are some of the debates in this context about what people want to see in their museums. We talked a little bit about the M+ project and the Hong Kong Museum of Art, and I don't know, do people in Hong Kong feel like those are their institutions? Are they excited about the M+? Do they think it's a thing for outsiders rather than people who live here? I imagine those are all the questions that are being debated. Hmm? Silence. I'm sure.
The question she asked is one that I think everyone in the room thinks about, because the Palace Museum is one where they think the Chinese government is sending in something to brainwash people here so that they identify as being Chinese. I think that's the main issue most people have with the Palace Museum. But there hasn't been a lot of debate, or there hasn't been allowed a lot of debate because it was kind of launched on people. I'm somebody who likes Chinese antiquities, so I'm happy to see a museum come as long as it's done in a proper way. Right. And I think a lot of the issues you described are very, very different in the Chinese context, because museums in China now are more about Chinese identity and nationality and trying to get people to feel, and it's very different from, they're not trying to show that they are inclusive. I don't think there are any museums in China that are trying to bring in arts from around the world.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, one thing I want to say about that, though, is that we think that we put all the onus on the museum, but we as visitors should also learn critical skills. So, there is that thing of being socialized to kind of take the authorial voice and accept it, and museums are, I saw instances where museums are making sure that people understand that the curator is a human being with opinions, not God. Putting photos on the wall of the curator, having them write a personal statement. I think that's important, right? In demystifying things. But I think it's also our responsibility as visitors to sort of not take it as fact and think critically. You read things, you don't accept them just because it's black and white. And the same thing with museums. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've witnessed a huge amount of museums being built in China, just to follow up on the last question, but a lot of them have actually been private museums. So individual initiatives, and I'm just wondering whether you've had a chance to think about that within your national cosmopolitanism scale type of continuum.
I did not include private museums in my sample, but and that's kind of new thing in the U.S. context, seen as kind of what's the word I'm looking for, when you show off what you have, like vanity projects, right? Vanity projects. So, so what is the trade-off of having people be able to see and engage with beautiful objects that someone is rich and powerful enough to collect, versus having that person insinuate themselves in the art world and shift it in different ways, have their collection become more valuable, all those kinds of economic interests that enter in. And I don't imagine that many private museums would be thinking about their civic duty if they could get away with it. So.
Thank you. I was wondering if you have any come across any successful cases, I guess, where you see museums doing the role of bringing in the conversation of social inclusion and celebrating diversity, but also sometimes might not be what the museum did, but how the user responds to it. Any cases you can share?
Yes, I can. The museum I was maybe the most impressed by was the Queen's Museum. The Queen's Museum is, located in the borough of Queens, so not in the center where the center of Manhattan, where all of the, most famous cultural institutions are. It's not a museum with a big permanent collection at all. It's located in a park that was the site of the World's Fair in 1939 and 1964. And in fact, it's in the building that was the New York State Pavilion, I think. And so they didn't have a lot to lose because nobody was going there anyway. You have to really go out of your way to get there. And so they the man who was the head of that museum and is now the cultural commissioner for New York City hired community organizers to go out into the community and do things that that kind of were recognizable enough to people, like gave them a bridge to come in, but then sort of took them somewhere where they wouldn't have gone necessarily, and this was off-site, and then after people would get comfortable and participate, they'd say, there's a museum down the street, and you can go there, and there's English as second language classes, and there's a gay and lesbian film festival, and there's Taiwanese, we'll lend you our facilities to have your Taiwanese dance performance for your kids. And so they kind of made, his thinking was that museums should be like libraries, they should be resources. And that people would come together in this space and sort of see each other in the bathroom and think, oh, I'm part of. So you could take the English as a second language class in your own language, the first level, but then you had to take it all in English in the second level. So all of these orchestrated ways to bring people together. And then there was a very interesting, with the public programming, so this is the most diverse borough, and it's many people from Asia and Latin America. And so many of the folks are undocumented, and so there was an artist in residence who did this installation where she did video letters for truck drivers who couldn't go back home, and then they sent them back to Ecuador, but then they also had like a public presentation, and this started this relationship with Ecuador. So they have curatorial exchanges and sort of sharing of collections and everything, and so they joke that the museum is better known in Ecuador than in New York City. But I just thought those were really creative ways of bringing community in, including. This is a park where lots of immigrants go and play soccer and stuff, or cricket on the weekends, and you can come into the museum, use the bathroom before you have to pay to enter. So just another way to make it a space that's welcoming and useful to people. So,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any comments or questions? Maybe it's time for us to wrap it up then. Thank you so much, Peggy, for today, for the presentation. Thank you.